The combine lurched. Not a shimmy, not a rattle, a full, shuddering, bone-deep lurch, and then nothing, just silence. 412 acres of standing corn in Iroquois County, Illinois. October 4, 1998. The sky overhead the color of a bruise at the edges, a hard northwest wind bending the stalks in long, whispering waves. And sitting in the cab of a Case IH 2388 combine, $185,000 worth of machine, not 2 years old, was a man named Gerald Gerry Polcyn, 44 years old, third-generation corn farmer, staring at a dashboard that had just gone completely dark. He tried the key, click, he tried it again. The engine turned over and fired, but the separator warning light came on before he even moved. Then, from somewhere deep in the guts of that machine, came a sound like a playing card in bicycle spokes. A high, papery clicking that didn't belong in any service manual ever printed. Gerry Polcyn pulled off his John Deere cap. Yes, he wore a John Deere cap. We'll get to why that matters, and he said, out loud to nobody, "What in the world are you doing to me?" This is that story. Let me paint you a picture of Iroquois County, Illinois in the fall of 1998, because place matters. Place always matters. It sits in the flat, dark-soiled heart of the American Corn Belt, roughly 90 miles south of Chicago, just far enough from the city that the only skyline you see is the elevator grain tower at Watseka standing silver against a flat horizon. The land there is almost preternaturally level. Glaciers saw to that 10,000 years ago, and in harvest season it smells like green corn silk and diesel fuel and the particular dusty sweet perfume of dry husks being shredded through a separator drum at 1,000 RPM. 1998 was not a kind year for corn farmers in that part of Illinois. Corn prices had collapsed. The USDA was projecting a national average of around $1.85 a bushel, barely above the cost of production for a mid-sized operation. The Asian financial crisis had crushed export demand. Brazil was flooding the market. Every bushel a farmer left standing was money he couldn't afford to lose, and every hour of downtime during harvest was a gamble with the weather, with early frost, with rain, with the slow, creeping anxiety that gets into a farmer's chest around mid-October and doesn't leave until the last load is delivered. The farms around Watseka were big operations by then, 600, 800, some over 1,000 acres, all riding the wave of equipment that had gotten larger and faster and more computerized than anyone had imagined 20 years earlier. The Case IH 2388 was the machine of the moment. It had just come out the year before the evolution of the legendary 2188, and dealers were selling them as fast as they could get them off the truck. 12-row head. 275 horsepower, 30% more capacity than anything that had come before it. It was, in every sense of the word, the future. And the future was sitting dead in Gerald Polcyn's field. Let me tell you about Gerry Polcyn, because you need to understand who this man was before you understand what he did. His grandfather, Stanislaw Polcyn, came over from Poznan, Poland in 1921 with $38 and a willingness to work that would have shamed a draft horse. He bought 80 acres outside Watseka on credit, farmed it with a team of Belgians, and paid it off in 11 years. His son, Gerry's father Edmund, doubled it to 160. Edmund was a quiet, methodical man who could rebuild a carburetor by feel in the dark, and who never, in his life, paid full price for anything he could repair himself. Gerry inherited both the land and the instinct. He was not a flashy man. He drove a 1989 Chevy pickup that had well north of 180,000 miles on it, and smelled permanently of WD-40 and whatever he'd last hauled in the bed. He kept a spiral notebook in his shirt pocket, a green mead, always green. His wife Carol said he'd been carrying one since high school, in which he wrote down observations. Machine hours, fuel consumption, weather anomalies, things that didn't quite add up yet but might someday. By 1998, Gerry was farming 412 acres, a modest operation by Iroquois County standards. He didn't own the 2388. He was custom farming with it, running harvest for 3 neighbors, splitting the machine cost across multiple jobs to make it pencil. He put down $47,000 of his own savings as his portion of the cooperative agreement, and he was paying it off at $1,100 a month. Every day of downtime wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a financial wound. What Gerry knew, what his neighbors sometimes forgot, was machinery, not the computerized kind, the old kind. He'd grown up working alongside his father on a 1956 Case 400 tractor and a 1968 International 403 combine, machines with no electronics, no sensors, no error codes. Machines you diagnosed with your ears and your hands and your nose. Machines that taught you, if you were paying attention, that every failure announces itself before it happens. Every failure has a voice if you know how to listen. That's what Gerry Polcyn knew. Now, every story like this has a counterweight, a contrast, and in Iroquois County in the fall of 1998, that counterweight had a name: Brad Kessler. Brad Kessler was 31 years old and the lead service technician. He preferred the title Senior Agricultural Systems Specialist, which was printed right there on his business card in a font that probably cost extra at Midwest Case IH, the largest red dealer between Kankakee and Champaign. Brad was good-looking in a catalog photo sort of way. He wore his blue dealer polo shirts with the collar turned up, drove a white GMC Sierra with dealer logos on both doors, and had what you might charitably call an energetic confidence in his own abilities. Brad had been to the factory training program in Racine, Wisconsin, twice. He had 6 official Case IH certifications, including one for the 2388 specifically, which had been out for exactly 14 months. He carried a laptop, a Toshiba satellite, which in 1998 was still enough to impress people at a dealership, loaded with diagnostic software called AFS Connect that could, in theory, read fault codes from the 2388's electronic control modules. Brad was the kind of man who, when he showed up to your farm, checked his own reflection in the combine's grain tank cover before he started talking. He was the kind of man who said things like, "These newer machines need trained eyes, not farmer intuition." He had said those exact words, or something close to them, to Gerry Polcyn on a previous service call 6 months earlier. Gerry had said nothing in return, which Brad had taken as agreement. It was not agreement. Brad was also, in October of 1998, the 3rd technician sent out to the Polcyn farm to fix a problem that had now persisted for 4 days. The first technician, a younger man named Kyle, had replaced the feeder house drive belt at a cost of $312 and declared the problem solved. The combine ran for 2 hours and then quit again. The second technician, a regional specialist flown in from the Iowa Territory, had replaced the main separator ECM, the electronic control module that managed the separator engagement, at a cost of $1,840. The combine ran for 40 minutes and then quit again. Now Brad Kessler was climbing out of his GMC Sierra on a cold Tuesday morning, laptop under his arm, and Gerry Polcyn's farmer neighbors, Dale Huisman, Roy Kettler, Bob Vance, all of them with their own harvest sitting uncut, were leaning on the tailgate of Gerry's Chevy watching. The thing you have to understand about harvest time in farm country is that any breakdown on any farm draws an audience. It's not cruelty, it's community. These men had all been through breakdowns of their own. They'd all stood next to a dead machine at the wrong time of year and felt that hollow, nauseating feeling in the chest. So they came, they stood, they offered coffee from a thermos and silent companionship. But there was also, if we're being honest, an edge of theater to it. Dale Huisman was the biggest farmer in that cooperative, 1,100 acres, 2 brand new John Deere 9610 combines, the kind of man who went to the Farm Bureau banquet every year and sat at the front table. He had been diplomatically skeptical of the 2388 cooperative from the start. He hadn't said so directly. Dale wasn't a cruel man, but he had made small remarks. He had described the 2388 as a lot of sophistication for a 3-man co-op. He had mentioned more than once that his 9610s had never had an unplanned breakdown in 2 seasons. So when Brad Kessler pulled up and started setting up his laptop on the hood of his Sierra, Dale folded his arms and watched with the quiet, patient expression of a man who has already decided how a story ends. "Morning, Brad," Gerry said. He was standing next to the combine, wearing canvas work pants and a flannel shirt, hands in his pockets. "Morning, Gerry." Brad popped open the laptop, connected a diagnostic cable to the port on the 2388's cab interface, and started typing. "I've been going over the previous service records. I think what we're looking at here is a secondary ECM failure, the residue processing module. It's a known issue with early production 2388s. I've already got a replacement on order from Des Moines." "Another module," Gerry said. It was not quite a question. These machines are extremely sophisticated, Brad said without looking up from the laptop. The electronics are interconnected in ways that can cascade. When Kyle replaced the belt, that didn't address the root cause, and when the regional guy replaced the separator ECM, that was correct, but the residue module was already compromised by the same root fault. It's a domino effect. What's the part run? Dale asked from the tailgate. The residue processing ECM is about $2,200 installed, Brad said. Should have it by Thursday. 2 more days, 2 days at peak harvest. Gerry did the math without moving a muscle in his face. He was about 800 bushels behind. At $1.85 a bushel, that was already $1,480 sitting in the field. Add the parts costs so far, $312 plus $1,840, now another $2,200. He was looking at over $4,300 in repair costs on a problem that hadn't been fixed once. Can I ask you something, Brad? Gerry said. Sure. What's the fault code reading right now? Brad looked at the screen. 322, separator drive fault. And the last 2 times it was brought in, what were the fault codes? Brad hesitated just barely. Same code, 322. So same code 3 times, 2 different parts replaced, neither one fixed it. Gerry said this very quietly, not aggressively, factually, like reading numbers from a ledger. Brad looked up. Gerry, I understand your frustration, but these are highly complex systems. You need. What's the separator slip clutch look like? The question sat in the air for a moment. Brad frowned slightly. The slip clutch. Yeah. The fault code is pointing to the ECM, Brad said. I know what the fault code is pointing to, Gerry said. I'm asking about the slip clutch. And here is where, if you will allow me, this scene reveals everything about the 2 men involved. Because Brad Kessler, with his 6 certifications and his Toshiba laptop and his 17 months of 2388 training, did not answer the question. He pivoted. He said, with the easy confidence of a man who has never truly been wrong in front of an audience. Gerry, the slip clutch is a mechanical component. Your diagnostic code is electrical. These are 2 separate systems. The software is showing us where the fault is, and the software is telling us. The software, Gerry said, is telling you what it can see. It can't see everything. Dale Huisman, leaning on the tailgate, made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was the sound a man makes when he's deciding whether to laugh. Roy Kettler looked at his boots. Bob Vance studied the horizon with tremendous interest. I'll be honest with you, Brad said, and his voice had taken on that particular tone, patient, professional, the voice of a man explaining something to someone who cannot possibly understand. I've been working on Case IH equipment for 6 years. I've been specifically trained on the 2388 platform. The separator ECM replacement was the correct call. The fault in this particular unit is cascading through multiple control modules, and the residue ECM is the next. I want to look at the separator slip clutch, Gerry said. The clutch is fine, Gerry. How do you know? Because the diagnostic. How do you know, Brad? Silence. The wind moved through the corn. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once and went quiet. Brad Kessler closed his laptop slowly. He smiled the smile of a man absorbing an indignity in front of witnesses. All right, Gerry, you want to look at the slip clutch, we can look at the slip clutch. But I want you to understand this isn't going to solve anything, and we're still going to need that part from Des Moines. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room or a field where someone with credentials dismissed someone with experience? Where a certificate on the wall outweighed a lifetime of listening? Hold that thought. Hold it, because what happens next is the reason this story has been told at fuel stops and sale barns and co-op meetings all across the Illinois Corn Belt for 25 years. To understand what Gerry Polcyn suspected, you need to know something about how a combine separator works, and I promise to make this as clear and vivid as possible, because the machinery is the heart of this story. When a combine like the 2388 harvests corn, it's doing something almost miraculous in mechanical terms. The ear comes off the stalk, gets pulled into the feeder house, and then gets beaten, thrashed, and tumbled through the separator, a rotor spinning at anywhere between 200 and 1,100 RPM depending on crop conditions, surrounded by concave screens that let grain fall through while ejecting stalks and cobs and chaff out the back. The power to spin that rotor comes from the engine through a series of belts, shafts, and critically, a slip clutch. Now a slip clutch is a beautiful piece of farm engineering. It's essentially a mechanical fuse. Under normal conditions, it locks up solid and transmits full power. But when something goes wrong, when a green ear of corn jams the rotor, when a rock gets through, when the machine is asked to do something it physically cannot do, the slip clutch does exactly what its name says. It slips, it absorbs the shock, it protects the rotor from catastrophic damage. In the original design, when the slip clutch releases, the combine's sensors detect the drop in rotor speed and generate a fault code. In the 2388, that fault code was 322, separator drive fault. Now, here's what Brad Kessler's training had told him. Fault code 322 means an ECM is failing to send or receive the correct signal to engage the separator. The electronic systems are at fault. Here's what Gerry Polcyn's 30 years of listening to machinery told him. A code that appears, causes shutdown, and then resets with the key every single time in the same sequence in the same conditions is not a randomly failing electronic module. A failing module fails in unpredictable patterns. This was completely predictable. Something was causing the slip clutch to slip, something physical, something mechanical. And the computer, faithfully reporting what its sensors detected, was reporting the symptom, rotor slowdown, not the cause. But here's what made Gerry Polcyn's suspicion not just a feeling but a diagnosis: his green mead notebook. He'd been keeping notes every day since the problem started. Each time the machine quit, he'd written down the time, the crop conditions, the rotor speed setting, the moisture reading, and one more thing, the outside temperature. The machine had quit at 9:14 a.m. on day 1. It had quit at 9:08 a.m. on day 2, at 9:22 a.m. on day 3, and at 9:31 a.m. on day 4. Every single time, within 20 minutes of the same time of day. Before 10 o'clock in the morning. After 10, the machine ran without a single hiccup. 8-9 hours of flawless harvest, and then the next morning, same thing. Gerry had circled that pattern in his notebook with a red pen and underlined it twice. Before 10, every time. He'd lain awake at 3 in the morning thinking about what changed at 10 o'clock. The dew burned off by 10. The corn, which had been cold and slightly stiff overnight, corn that retains a little more moisture in the morning, that is fractionally stiffer as a crop, that puts fractionally more mechanical load on a separator rotor, warmed up. And the machine, which had been cold-soaked overnight, sitting in a 42-degree Illinois October, warmed up too. Cold metal, cold grease, cold springs. The slip clutch on a case IH-2388 is held in engagement by a set of Belleville springs, disc-shaped steel washers arranged in a stack that create a precise, calibrated clamping force. When the springs are cold, they are slightly stiffer. When they are worn, and Gerry suspected these springs were worn, because the machine was a 1997 early production run, and he'd read a small notice in a back issue of Farm Journal about early 2388 slip clutches having an accelerated wear issue that Case IH had quietly revised in the 1999 production run. When those springs are worn, the difference between cold and warm is the difference between enough clamping force and not quite enough. In the morning cold with a slightly stiffer crop, the worn springs couldn't hold. The clutch slipped. The sensor saw rotor slow down. The ECM threw code 322. The machine shut down. By 10 o'clock, the springs had expanded microscopically with heat. The clamp force came back. The machine ran perfectly. 3 technicians, 2 ECMs, 1 belt, and $4,350 in parts and labor had been chasing a ghost in the electronics of a machine whose actual problem was a set of worn steel washers in a slip clutch, sitting cold in an Illinois cornfield. Let me tell you something about that. Gerry Polcyn didn't know this for cert. He was working from observation, pattern, and a 30-year education in mechanical cause and effect that no factory training program in Racine, Wisconsin had ever seen fit to include. He was, in the language of the diagnostic manual, outside the prescribed diagnostic process. He was, in the language of the field, right. The separator slip clutch on a case IH-2388 is located on the right side of the machine, behind an access panel that requires removing 4 bolts 3/8 inch and sliding the panel off. It is not a hidden component. It is not buried. It is accessible by design because it is a wear item. It is supposed to be inspected. Gerry had a 3/8 socket in his left hip pocket. He'd had it there since that morning. He handed his coffee thermos to Roy Kettler, walked to the right side of the combine, crouched down, and started pulling bolts. Brad Kessler stood with his arms folded, laptop under one arm, watching with the expression of a man witnessing something slightly beneath him. Dale Huisman had come off the tailgate now and was standing closer, his own curiosity overriding his skepticism. The panel came off. The slip clutch sat there in the morning light, a steel disc assembly about the diameter of a dinner plate, the bevel springs arranged in their stack on the center shaft. Gerry reached in with 2 fingers and tried to compress the spring stack manually. On a properly functioning clutch in good condition, you should not be able to do this. The clamping force should be significant. His fingers moved the stack a 1/4 inch with almost no resistance. He looked up at Brad Kessler. He didn't say anything, he just looked at him for a moment, then he turned back to the clutch. "These springs are shot," he said quietly. "They're not maintaining clamping force. Cold morning, stiff crop, they can't hold. Machine warms up, they stiffen just enough to work." He paused. "Has nothing to do with the ECM." Brad Kessler opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the spring stack, reached in himself and tried to compress it, took his hand back. "That," he started, then stopped. "How much are the springs?" Roy Kettler asked. "You can get a Belleville spring kit for this clutch at Binkley and Hurst Farm Supply in Watseka," Gerry said. He had called ahead. That morning before Brad Kessler arrived, he had called Bill Hurst at the parts counter and asked about spring kits for the 2388 separator clutch. Bill had them in stock, an aftermarket kit, equivalent spec, made by a company out of Newton, Iowa. "They're $14.27, Gerry said. Nobody said anything. The wind went through the corn, $14.27. Gerry stood up, pulled his green Mead notebook from his shirt pocket, and opened it to the page where he'd circled the morning failure times in red ink. He handed it wordlessly to Dale Huisman. Dale looked at it for a long moment, the times, the column of temperatures, the red circle, the 2 underlines, and nodded once. Slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating something. Brad Kessler was looking at the clutch assembly. To his credit, and this matters because this story isn't about villainy, it's about blindness, to his credit, he wasn't defensive anymore. He was looking. He was doing what the laptop had made him stop doing, actually looking at the machine. "The diagnostic code path doesn't route through the clutch," he said quietly, not argumentatively, as a plain statement of a flaw he was only now seeing. "The protocol assumes a functional clutch. If the clutch is slipping, the ECM sees rotor slowdown and flags itself." "Right," Gerry said, "the code is correct. The clutch is slipping. The ECM isn't broken, it's doing its job. It's telling you the rotor slowed down. It just doesn't know why. You have to know why yourself." Brad nodded very slowly. Gerry drove to Watseka in his Chevy, bought the spring kit from Bill Hurst for $14.27. He kept the receipt. Carol said he kept every receipt ever since 1973 and drove back. He installed the new Belleville springs in 31 minutes using a socket set, a torque wrench, and a procedure he'd talked through with his father years earlier when the old 403 combine had a similar issue. He replaced the access panel, he climbed up into the cab, he started the 2388. The separator engaged, the rotor spun up to 750 RPM, every light on the dashboard went green. And it was 9:40 in the morning, cold, the crop was stiff, the dew was still burning off. And the machine ran. Dale Huisman was standing 10 feet from the combine when it started, his arms at his sides. Bob Vance had his hat in his hand. Roy Kettler was squinting slightly as if the sunlight had suddenly changed. Gerry let the machine warm up for 5 minutes. Then he lowered the 12-row head, put the combine in gear, and drove it into the corn. He kept his eyes on the mirrors for 30 seconds, 40, a minute. Stalks went in, grain came out, everything functioned as designed. He drove it for an hour straight while the other men stood and watched, and nobody said much of anything at all. There is a particular silence in farm country that is different from other silences. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of men who have just witnessed something that requires reassessment. It has weight to it. It has texture. It smells like cold dirt and exhaust and the faint sweetness of harvested corn. That was the silence that settled over the Polcyn farm on the morning of October 6, 1998, as a Case IH 2388 combine, which had defeated 2 specialists, a regional expert, 2 ECMs, a drive belt, 4 days, and approximately $4,350 in parts and labor, moved steadily through a field of standing corn because an old farmer had bought a $14 spring kit and listened to his machine. Brad Kessler stood by his white GMC Sierra for a long time. He was staring at his laptop screen, but he wasn't typing anything. He was thinking. You could see it in the set of his shoulders. When a man with that kind of confidence goes quiet and still, there is something genuine happening inside him. He was not stupid. He had never been stupid. He had been trained in a particular way to see a particular set of things, and the training had created a blind spot that he genuinely hadn't known was there. He walked over to Gerry's Chevy, where Roy Kettler was sitting on the tailgate. "Tell Gerry," he started, then stopped. "Tell him I'd like to look at his notebook before I leave, if that's all right." Roy Kettler raised his eyebrows. "You'll have to ask him yourself." Brad nodded. "Yeah, I will." Dale Huisman had walked out into the field and was standing with his arms folded watching the combine work. After a while he said, to nobody in particular, "Hell of a thing." He meant it as a compliment. In Dale Huisman's vocabulary, hell of a thing was the highest available form of praise for something he hadn't expected and couldn't explain. Bob Vance, standing beside him, understood this perfectly and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. When Gerry came back around on his first pass and stopped the combine at the end of the row, he climbed down to check the sample box, the little window in the grain tank where you can see the quality of what's coming in, and Brad Kessler walked over and stood beside him. "I owe you a conversation," Brad said. "You owe me a conversation, 2 ECMs and a belt," Gerry said, not unkindly, factually. "I know it," Brad paused. "I don't know how to. I'm trying to figure out how to write a service bulletin that says listen to the farmer." Gerry looked at him for a moment, then he almost smiled, almost. "You start by listening to the machine," he said. "The farmer comes later." Gerry Polcyn finished his 412 acres in 4 days. He ran the 2388 for the rest of that season without a single fault code related to the separator. At the end of harvest, he had the 2 replaced ECMs credited back to his account. It took 6 weeks of letters and 1 phone call from his lawyer in Kankakee, but he got them. The belt was not refunded. He let that one go. He was not, in his own words, a man who counted every nickel of a hard-won battle. He kept the receipt for the spring kit, $14.27. Bill Hurst at Binkley and Hurst wrote on the receipt in blue pen, "Belleville Spring Kit, 2388 separator clutch." Gerry put it in a file folder labeled Machine Records 1998 in his filing cabinet in the machine shed where it sits to this day. But the story didn't end in that field. Brad Kessler, to his genuine and lasting credit, wrote up a detailed internal service note for Midwest Case IH describing the failure mode. Belleville Spring Fatigue and Early Production 2388 separator clutches. Temperature-dependent slip diagnostic code 322 appearing without ECM fault. He included, with Gerry's permission, a summary of the failure pattern Gerry had documented in his notebook, the morning time correlation, the temperature data, the warming threshold. That service note made its way, through channels that service notes sometimes travel, to Case IH's Technical Services Division. Within 18 months, Case IH had issued a formal field service bulletin, FSB number 98C224. If you want to look it up, recommending proactive inspection and replacement of Belleville Spring stacks and early production 2388 separators. The procedure was added to the standard annual service checklist for the model year. Nobody at Case IH ever sent Gerry Polcyn a letter. Nobody called him. Nobody acknowledged that a 44-year-old corn farmer in Iroquois County, Illinois had identified a widespread production defect by keeping a cheap spiral notebook and listening to his machine. He wasn't surprised by that. He hadn't done it for acknowledgement. But farmers across the Corn Belt, in Iowa, in Indiana, in Minnesota, and Nebraska, who brought their 2388s in for spring service in 1999 and 2000 had their separator clutch springs inspected and replaced without incident, without diagnostic drama, without 4 days of harvest loss. They didn't know why. They just got a clean bill of health and went back to work. Gerry Polcyn was the reason. Dale Huisman bought one of Gerry's neighbors out in 2001, expanding his operation to 1,400 acres. Before he signed the papers, he called Gerry and asked him if he'd be willing to custom harvest his corn too, both 2388s, expanded co-op, Gerry managing all machine maintenance. Gerry said yes. He still wore the John Deere cap. He said it was for the shade, not the brand. Polcyn, Gerry's wife, framed the $14.27 receipt. She put it in the kitchen, between a photograph of Gerry's grandfather Stanislaus standing in front of the original 80 acres and a school portrait of their oldest son Danny, who was studying agricultural engineering at the University of Illinois and would go on to work, in an irony that would have made Gerry laugh if he'd lived to see it, as a technical diagnostic consultant for C&H Industrial, the parent company of Case IH. Danny told his father's story in his job interview. He got the job. Brad Kessler left dealership work in 2003 and went back to school. He got a degree in agricultural systems engineering from Purdue. His thesis was on the gap between electronic diagnostic systems and mechanical failure modes in modern combines. Specifically, the conditions under which sensor-reported fault codes can mask or misattribute root causes. His thesis advisor told him it was one of the most practically grounded engineering papers he'd supervised in a decade. Brad has been quoted as saying in interviews that the education that mattered most in his career was not from Racine, Wisconsin. It was from a field in Iroquois County, Illinois, on a 42-degree October morning, watching an old farmer pull a panel off a combine and compress a spring stack with 2 fingers. He still sends Gerry a Christmas card every year. Gerry writes back on a piece of paper torn from a green Mead notebook. Let me ask you something before we get to the end of this. Think about the people in your life who have been dismissed because they were old or quiet or didn't have the right certifications. Think about the wisdom that gets set aside in favor of whatever the newest technology claims to tell us. Now think about how many $14 fixes are sitting under how many access panels, waiting for someone to unplug the laptop and put their hands on the machine. Let me tell you what I believe this story is really about. Because it's not about one farmer and one combine and one set of Belleville springs, though all of those details matter and all of them are true to the world they came from. It's about a particular kind of wisdom that the modern world has developed a habit of devaluing. The wisdom of pattern recognition. The wisdom of the notebook. The wisdom that comes not from being trained to look for a specific set of answers, but from spending 30 years asking questions that nobody told you to ask. Gerry Polcyn did not know when he started keeping that notebook that he would ever need the data in it. He kept it because his father had kept one and his father before him, and because something in his inherited understanding of farming told him that information doesn't know when it will be useful. You collect it anyway, you observe anyway, you write it down anyway. And then one October morning, when 3 specialists have failed and your harvest is sitting in the field and your bank account is bleeding, you open the notebook and the answer is right there. You put it there yourself because you were paying attention when it counted. There is something in the American agricultural tradition, something in the whole tradition of people who work with their hands in relationship with land and machine, and whether that understands this deeply. The farmer who can't afford to be wrong learns to read everything. He reads the color of exhaust and the pitch of engine noise and the feel of a steering wheel and the smell of a belt running hot. He develops a library in his body and his memory that no training program can replicate, because it was built one field at a time, one season at a time, one breakdown at a time. That is not romantic. That is not nostalgia. That is a diagnostic superpower that took 3 decades to build, and it diagnosed a case IH-2388 correctly when $4,000 worth of parts and 3 trained technicians could not. The machines have gotten more sophisticated since 1998. The computers have gotten faster. The diagnostic software has gotten better, and all of that is genuinely good. It has made farming safer and more efficient and more productive in ways that would astonish Gerry Polcyn's grandfather Stanislaus. But the fundamental truth has not changed. Software sees what it is written to see. Sensors measure what they are pointed at. Electronic systems diagnose within the parameters they are designed to diagnose within. And the thing that sees everything, the thing that notices what the software isn't looking at, what the sensor isn't pointed at, what the diagnostic protocol doesn't include, is still and has always been a human being who is paying careful attention. Don't let anyone tell you that old knowledge has an expiration date. Don't let anyone tell you that the person with the most certifications necessarily has the most understanding. And the next time someone hands you a fault code and calls it an answer, ask them if they've looked at the slip clutch. Because sometimes the whole problem is $14.27 sitting in an access panel that nobody thought to open. Take care of your machines, take care of your people, and never stop keeping the notebook. We'll see you next time on The Forgotten Farmer. Historical context note. The Case IH-2388 combine was a real machine, introduced in the 1997 model year as part of Case IH's axial flow series. Field service bulletins addressing Belleville spring wear-in separator clutch assemblies were a documented category of service action in this era of combine manufacturing. Corn prices in 1998 were genuinely depressed due to export market conditions and Brazilian competition, averaging near $1.85 bushel in many Midwest markets. Iroquois County, Illinois is a real agricultural county. All named characters, Gerald, Polcyn, Brad Kessler, Dale Huisman, and others, are fictional composites created for dramatic storytelling. Dialogue is dramatized. The diagnostic method described, including temperature-correlated failure pattern analysis and Belleville spring fatigue as a cause of false ECM fault codes, reflects real mechanical principles. Characters and events are fictional.